Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, everybody. You're here because you want to get to the bottom of things. You want to understand the world better, Ram,
Absolutely.
not just skim the surface.
Right.
And today, we are taking a deep dive into a topic that's obviously on a lot of people's minds these days.
That's right.
Depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
We've gone through a ton of material for this deep dive. We've got personal stories, scientific research, expert opinions, all kind of pointing towards, giving us a clearer picture of this whole thing, this whole topic of depression and anxiety.
Yeah. And that's the goal, right? To really sift through all of the noise and all the information and really come to the core of what's really important.
Yeah, and I think I'm really interested to share this because, like, if you've ever thought that depression was like all in your head or, just a chemical imbalance in the brain,
Right.
I think we've got some stuff here that will make you kind of rethink that.
Definitely. We're looking for those aha moments.
Yeah.
Those moments where you're like, wow, I never thought about it that way.
Right.
And we're also going to be presenting some ideas that may challenge conventional wisdom about depression and anxiety.
Yeah, so let's get into it.
All right.
So one of the first things that I thought was really interesting was this whole concept of the placebo effect.
Right.
And the sources kind of take us back in time to the late 1700s with this story about these things called Perkins tractors.
Yeah, these were basically metal rods that this guy Elisha Perkins claimed could cure all sorts of ailments.
It's crazy. And they didn't do anything. It was just like the belief.
It was the belief
that they would work.
Yeah, and it's amazing because a lot of people really did feel better simply because they believed that these devices would work. Even though, as we know now, they had no real medical properties.
That's like the power of the mind or something.
Yeah, and what's even more interesting is that even back then, doctors recognized this.
Like they knew that this was happening.
Yeah, like there was this one doctor, John Haygarth, and he even did experiments with fake tractors.
Wow.
And he saw the same results. The people who got the fake tractors still felt relief.
Just because they thought they were getting the real deal?
Exactly. It's really a testament to the power of the mind-body connection.
Yeah, it really makes you think. So let's fast forward then to, the present day.
Right.
And we're talking about, antidepressants.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this placebo effect thing becomes super important, right?
It does.
Because one of the researchers, we looked at Irving Kirsch, he's done some fascinating work that suggests that maybe the big chunk of the benefit that people get from antidepressants, it might not be from like the drug itself acting on the brain, but from this placebo effect.
Right.
Like you believe it's going to help, and so it does.
Right. He looked at all these studies, and he found that the difference between taking the actual antidepressant and a sugar pill was surprisingly small.
Right.
Yeah. So the main takeaway here is that the placebo effect in antidepressant trials is really, really strong, which really challenges this idea that these medications are working solely through their chemical action on the brain.
Right. So it's not just about the chemicals. There's like this whole other layer.
Exactly. But it's important to note that this is an ongoing debate among experts.
Okay, so there's not like a clear consensus on this.
Right. Like some people, like Peter Kramer, he's a big proponent of antidepressants. He argues that they do offer a real advantage.
Okay.
Especially for people with more severe depression.
Right.
So there are definitely different expert opinions on how effective these medications really are.
Okay.
And how much of a role the placebo effect plays.
Right. So it's not as simple as just, take this pill and you'll be happy.
No, not at all.
Okay. Well, that kind of makes sense because like I know that, there could be some pretty serious side effects.
Yes, absolutely. And Kirsch actually points to some research that suggests that there are increased risks associated with taking antidepressants.
Okay, what kind of risks?
Well, he mentions things like an increased risk of suicide in younger people.
Oh, wow.
Violent behavior, death in older adults.
Really?
An increased risk of stroke, type 2 diabetes, and even complications during pregnancy like miscarriage and birth defects.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And then there's also the whole issue of withdrawal. Right?
Yeah, and it can be really difficult for some people to stop taking these medications.
Right.
The withdrawal symptoms can be really severe.
Yeah, I've heard that. It can be really tough.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a lot to consider. But then there's also the issue of like how these drug trials are conducted.
Right. The sources highlight some potential issues there.
Like what?
Well, think about it. If you're recruiting people to participate in a drug trial, you're essentially asking them to take a drug that could potentially have side effects for a long period of time.
Oh, right.
Often for a relatively small payment.
Yeah.
So that could mean that the people who are participating in these trials are particularly vulnerable or desperate.
So they might be more likely to say that the drug is helping, even if it's not.
Exactly. And they also might be attracted by the comprehensive care that they receive during the trial.
Like what kind of care?
You know, things like therapy support groups, things that they might not have access to otherwise.
Oh, I see.
So it raises this question of whether the benefits that we're seeing are actually just from the drug itself.
Right.
Or also due to these other supportive factors.
It's like a package deal almost.
Yeah, in a way.
Yeah, and it's not always clear, what's really doing the work.
Right.
And there's this one trial that we looked at, the STAR-D trial.
Yeah.
Which stands for Sequence Treatment Alternatives to Relieve Depression.
That's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful. And it was this big study that followed people, in real-world clinical settings as they tried different antidepressants. And the results were all over the place.
Yeah, they were very mixed.
Yeah, not nearly as straightforward as you might expect if these drugs were a simple solution.
Right.
So it really emphasizes the point that each person's response to these medications can be really different.
Yes, very much so.
So, going back to what we were talking about earlier with the Perkins tractors and now with these antidepressants, it's like the power of belief and how difficult it is to pinpoint the actual effects of medication.
Right.
That's a big theme in the stuff we've been looking at.
Yeah, it really is. And it leads us to a point where our sources start offering a different perspective on depression.
Okay, like what?
Well, they challenge this purely biological view of depression, this idea that it's all about a chemical imbalance in the brain. For example, there's Johann Hari, and she talks about the importance of context. Okay. She argues that if we only focus on the brain, we risk disconnecting people from their own experiences and from the people around them.
Yeah, so it's not just what's going on inside your head. It's also about like the environment you're in, the people you're with, your whole life situation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've seen how complicated these biological interventions like antidepressants can be.
Right.
But our sources are really encouraging us to consider a much broader perspective.
Okay.
To look at the context in which these conditions actually arise.
I like that.
Yeah.
And there's this one story that really stuck with me.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. One of the personal accounts, this guy was in Vietnam and he got super sick. Like really bad nausea.
Oh.
And he went to see a local doctor. And the doctor told him that he needed his nausea.
He needed his nausea.
Yeah. The doctor said it was like a message telling him that something was wrong. And I thought that was so interesting because it's like maybe our emotional pain is also a messenger.
Like it's trying to tell us something.
Yeah, it's a signal that something deeper is going on.
Exactly.
An idea actually isn't entirely new.
Really?
Yeah, historically, even within psychiatry, there was this understanding that grief, for example, could cause depressive symptoms.
Oh, I see.
So they were acknowledging a non-chemical origin in certain situations.
It's like your body and mind are reacting to something that happened in your life.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, that makes sense.
Yeah. And then there's the work of George Brown and Tyrrell Harris.
Okay.
They did this really important research in South London in the 1970s.
Okay.
And what's really fascinating about them is that they went into their research admitting that they were completely ignorant.
Ignorant.
Yeah, they said they were completely ignorant of the prevailing theories about depression.
Wow.
Which they actually felt was an advantage.
How so?
Well, because they didn't have any preconceived ideas shaping their approach.
It's like a fresh perspective.
Exactly. So they studied women in their community. And what they found was a strong connection between social factors.
Like what?
Things like poverty, ongoing stress, negative life events, and the likelihood of developing depression.
So like if you're struggling financially or dealing with a lot of stress, you're more likely to become depressed.
Yeah, that's what their research was suggesting. For example, they talked about this woman, Mrs. Trent.
Okay.
And her life was really difficult.
In what way?
Well, she was living in poverty.
Okay.
She had a lot of stress in her life. And she was also dealing with some really negative life events.
So basically her environment was really tough.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be connected to her depression.
Exactly.
Wow.
And their research really started to provide strong evidence for this link between our environment and our mental well-being.
Okay, but what about people who, aren't living in poverty?
Right. That's a really important point.
Yeah.
And Brown and Harris actually discovered that these links weren't just about poverty.
They found that sustained stress and negative experiences could lead to something they called the generalization of hopelessness.
The generalization of hopelessness.
Yeah, and this could affect people from all walks of life.
So it's not just about your economic situation, it's about like the overall stress and negativity in your life?
Exactly.
Okay.
And they argued that depression and anxiety can often be understandable responses to adversity.
Okay.
So it's not just a biological glitch.
Right. It's like your body and mind are reacting to the difficult things you're going through.
Exactly. So if this hopelessness stems from things happening in our lives,
Right.
it makes you wonder if focusing only on individual biology is missing a big part of the picture.
Right. It's like we're looking in the wrong place.
Yeah, in a way.
Okay.
And when we connect these findings to the broader picture that our sources are painting, we start to see a recurring theme.
Which is?
Disconnection.
Disconnection. Okay.
Yeah, a lot of the different causes of depression and anxiety that we're exploring can be understood as forms of disconnection.
Disconnection from what?
Well, disconnection from fundamental human needs.
Okay, so not just our biological needs, but like deeper needs.
Right.
Okay, I'm really interested to hear more about this. Can you give me some examples of like the specific ways that we can become disconnected?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the big ones that comes up is disconnection from meaningful work.
Meaningful work. Okay.
Yeah. There's a story about a guy named Joe.
Okay.
He worked in a paint shop.
Okay.
And he felt like he had no real purpose in his job.
Like he wasn't making a difference.
Yeah. And he also felt like he had very little control over what he did.
So it was just like a grind.
Yeah. He described it as soul-crushing.
Wow.
Yeah.
And is this something that's like, unique to Joe, or is this like a wider issue?
Well, Michael Marmot's Whitehall studies,
Okay.
they actually shed some light on this.
Okay.
He looked at civil servants in Britain, and he found that the lower-ranking civil servants had much higher rates of depression than the higher-ranking ones.
So it's like where you are in the hierarchy affects your mental health.
Yeah, and his research suggests that it wasn't necessarily about the amount of work itself,
Okay.
but more about the lack of control
Right.
that they had over their tasks.
So it's like feeling powerless in your job.
Exactly. And there's this story about a woman named Marjorie.
Okay.
She worked in a typing pool.
Okay.
And she had this idea for really simple improvement to the way they were doing things. But she didn't feel like she could even suggest it to her superior.
Because she didn't have the authority.
Yeah, she felt completely powerless.
Wow.
So that really illustrates this feeling of lack of control.
So it's not just about like being poor or rich. It's about feeling like you have a say in your work.
Exactly. And feeling like your work is valued when you're putting in the hours, but feeling like you're just a cog in a machine, it can really take a toll.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So that's disconnection from meaningful work. What are some other forms of disconnection?
Well, another really crucial one is disconnection from other people.
Loneliness.
Yeah, loneliness. And John Kichiopa's research on this is really fascinating.
Okay.
He found that loneliness isn't just a subjective feeling.
What do you mean?
Well, it has actual physical effects.
Like what?
Like an increased heart rate.
Really? So it's not just in our heads. It's like our bodies react to loneliness.
Exactly. And he also found that loneliness isn't just about being physically alone.
Okay.
It's about this deeper feeling of social disconnection.
So you could be surrounded by people.
Right.
And still feel lonely.
Exactly.
Okay. And what are the implications of that?
Well, he did this study where he followed older Americans
Okay.
who weren't initially depressed or lonely.
Okay.
And over time, the ones who became lonelier were more likely to develop depressive symptoms.
So loneliness could actually be a cause of depression.
That's what the research suggests.
Huh?
And then you contrast that with a community like the Hutterites,
Okay.
who have extremely low levels of loneliness.
Really?
Yeah. And it really highlights how closely our social connection is tied to how we live our lives.
Yeah. So it's not just about, your individual personality or whatever. It's about the community you're part of.
Exactly.
Okay.
But unfortunately, our sources also point to a decline in social connection in Western societies.
Really? Like we're becoming more lonely.
It seems that way. Robert Putnam's work,
Mm-hmm.
he talks about a decrease in family togetherness,
Okay.
and a growing number of people who say they have no close friends.
Wow, that's sad.
Yeah.
And is there any evidence that this is like actually harmful?
Well, Martha McClintock, she
Huh.
did this really interesting study with rats,
Okay.
and the isolated rats developed significantly more breast cancer tumors
Oh, wow.
than the rats who were living in groups.
So social isolation is actually physically harmful.
It seems that way.
Wow.
Weird.
And what about our brains? Like, does loneliness affect how we think?
Well, Cacioppo also found
Mm-hmm.
that lonely individuals tend to have this heightened threat detection response.
What does that mean?
Well, they're kind of hypervigilant for social slights.
Oh, so they're more likely to see rejection even if it's not there?
Exactly.
And that can lead to even more loneliness.
Exactly. It can become a vicious cycle.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
But what about like online connection?
Right. So Hilary Cash,
Hmm.
she did some really interesting work on internet addiction
Okay.
near Microsoft.
Right.
And she makes this really important point.
Okay.
She says that while we might think we're connecting online,
Mm-hmm.
it's often a poor substitute for real face-to-face interaction.
Right.
Like the kind of interaction that engages all of our senses
Mm-hmm.
and truly fulfills that human need for safe and caring connection.
Yeah, so it's like you can have thousands of followers online, but still feel deeply lonely.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay, so we've talked about disconnection from meaningful work and disconnection from other people.
Mm-hmm.
What are some other forms of disconnection?
Well, another really significant one is disconnection from meaningful values.
Meaningful values.
Yeah. Tim Kasser,
Okay.
he did some research
Mhm.
using something called the aspiration index.
Aspiration index.
Yeah,
Cool.
and this index measures how much people prioritize things like material possessions and wealth
Okay.
compared to things like relationships and making a difference.
Oh, I see. So it's like, what do you value most in life?
Exactly.
Okay.
And he found that people who strongly valued material things
Okay.
had higher rates of depression, anger,
Really?
and just poorer daily experiences overall.
Wow. So it's like chasing money and stuff doesn't actually make you happy.
Yeah, that's what his research suggests.
Huh. And what about actually achieving those material goals?
Well, that's the really interesting part. Kasser found that even when people achieved those extrinsic goals,
Okay.
like getting rich or buying a lot of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
it didn't actually lead to lasting happiness.
So it's like you get what you want,
Right.
but you're still not satisfied.
Exactly.
And why do you think that is?
Well, our sources point to the role of advertising.
Okay.
They argue that the advertising industry is really good at making us feel inadequate.
Right.
Like we're not good enough
Mhm.
unless we have the latest gadget or the newest clothes.
So it's like they're creating this sense of lack,
Exactly.
and then they're offering their products as the solution.
Yeah, it's a very clever strategy.
It is, and it's everywhere.
It is.
Okay, so that's disconnection from meaningful values. What about disconnection from like our past?
Right. Well, Vincent Valletti's work on adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs.
ACEs, okay.
Yeah. These are traumatic events that happen before the age of 18. And his research shows that they can have really long-lasting effects on our mental health.
Like what kind of effects?
Well, he talks about how people can develop all sorts of problems later in life
Mm-hmm.
as a result of these early traumas.
And what are some examples of ACEs?
Well, things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect witnessing domestic violence,
Okay.
growing up with a parent who has a mental illness or substance abuse problem.
So basically anything that makes you feel unsafe and insecure as a child.
Exactly.
And how does this connect to disconnection?
Well, when we experience trauma,
Mm-hmm.
it can create this sense of disconnection from ourselves.
Like we're not whole.
Yeah, and he gives these really powerful examples of women who gained weight
Okay.
as a way of protecting themselves.
Protecting themselves from what?
Well, after they had experienced abuse.
So the weight gain was like a coping mechanism.
Exactly. It was a way of creating a physical barrier between themselves and the world.
Wow. So it's like these seemingly negative behaviors
Right.
can actually be solutions to deeper problems.
Exactly. It's a way of trying to cope with the pain.
Yeah. And then there's also the psychological defense mechanism
Right,
where
yeah.
children who experience trauma blame themselves.
Yeah.
That's so sad.
It is. But it's a way for them to try and gain a sense of control
Okay.
in a situation where they were completely powerless.
So it's like, if it's my fault,
Mm-hmm.
then I could have done something to prevent it.
Exactly.
And that's easier than facing the fact that I was helpless.
Right.
Wow. Okay, we've talked about disconnection from meaningful work, disconnection from other people, disconnection from meaningful values, and disconnection from our past.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other forms of disconnection?
Well, Richard Wilkinson,
Okay.
he talks about how disconnection can also show up in how we perceive our status and respect.
Oh, status. Okay.
Yeah. And his work shows that societies with big gaps in income and status can increase stress and feelings of low self-worth.
So it's not just about being poor. It's about feeling like you're less than other people.
Exactly. And this can affect people across the whole social spectrum.
So even wealthy people can feel this sense of disconnection.
Yeah, if they're constantly comparing themselves to people who are even wealthier or have higher status.
It's like the keeping up with the Joneses thing.
Exactly.
And then there's Isabel Ben-Key.
Yes. She's a primatologist.
Okay.
And she made this really interesting observation about bonobos in captivity.
Gobos, okay.
Yeah, they're a type of ape.
Right.
And she noticed that they were exhibiting depression-like symptoms
Wow.
that were rarely seen in their wild counterparts.
Really? So captivity was making them depressed?
It seems that way.
Huh. And she connected this to humans.
Yeah, she suggests that humans also experience modern forms of captivity.
Okay. Like what?
Well, things like being stuck in jobs we hate,
Mm-hmm.
living in isolating environments,
Right.
being bombarded with consumerism. All of these things can contribute to this sense of disconnection.
And depression.
And depression.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's disconnection from status and respect. What about disconnection from, like, our future?
Right. Well, our sources explore this too.
Okay.
And they tell the story of Chief Plentycoo.
Okay.
He was the last great chief of the Crow Nation.
Okay.
And he witnessed the destruction of his people's way of life.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And the stories about his life,
Mhm.
they kind of stop after a certain point.
Really?
Yeah, there's this silence about his later years.
And why do you think that is?
Well, our sources suggest that it might be because he had lost his sense of purpose.
He didn't know what his place was anymore.
He had lost his connection to a meaningful future.
And this connects to depression.
Yeah. Michael Chandler.
Okay.
He did some research on cultural continuity in First Nations communities.
Okay.
And he found that being able to envision a positive future is really important for forming a strong identity
Okay.
and for protecting against suicide.
So like, if you don't have a sense of hope for the future,
Right.
you're more vulnerable to depression and despair.
Exactly. And he even interviewed teenagers
Yeah.
who were in psychiatric units,
Hmm.
and a lot of them struggled to imagine what their lives might look like in the years ahead.
So they had lost that sense of possibility.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then closer to home,
Okay.
there's Angela's story.
Okay.
Yeah. She talks about her experience with unstable work.
Okay.
She never knew what her hours were going to be.
Mhm.
And it created this constant anxiety and stress.
Right. Because she couldn't plan for anything.
Exactly. And it also made her feel ashamed.
Ashamed. Why?
Well, because she felt like she should be able to handle it.
Right. Like she was failing somehow.
Yeah. And this lack of security,
Mm-hmm.
it made it really hard for her to connect with a positive future.
So it's not just about, like, big existential crises. It's also about, like, the everyday insecurity
Right.
of not knowing what's going to happen next.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about all these different forms of disconnection,
Mm-hmm.
and it's kind of a lot to take in.
It is. But our sources also offer some reasons for hope.
Okay, I could definitely use some of that right now.
Yeah. And they explore the power of reconnection.
Reconnection, totally.
Yeah. And there's this really inspiring story about the Cody Housing Project in Berlin.
Okay.
The residents were facing eviction
Okay.
because of rising rents.
Right.
And they came together and organized.
Okay.
And not only did they manage to freeze their rents,
Wow.
but they also built this incredibly strong sense of community.
Really?
Yeah, and people reported feeling much happier and more supported.
Even though they were still facing this huge threat of eviction.
Exactly. And there was this one woman, Nori.
Okay.
She was going through some really intense personal difficulties.
Like what?
Well, she had lost her husband.
Oh, wow.
And she was also dealing with some health problems.
So she was really struggling.
Yeah. But even she found solace and strength in the community that had formed around this housing struggle.
So it's like even when you're going through really tough times,
right?
Connection can make a difference.
Exactly.
Okay.
And what's really significant about the Cody example